This is a video on how to deter animals from digging under a gate. To keep this video as short as possible, I'll do a separate video on how to keep animals from digging under a fence. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And if you're out on a forum where somebody's looking for an answer to something like this, please give them a link to this video. Where I live in Florida, the biggest problem I have is probably armadillos. Next would be dogs and turtles, but who knows what you might have digging under your fence. It's best to have a solid material instead of something like fence wire, because wire materials they can see through, and sometimes if the animal can see through it, it makes him more inclined to dig. There are a lot of other methods people use, but a lot of them don't work well for drive-through gates, and in my case that's what I really needed. Some of them work okay for walk-through gates, some of them don't even work good for walk-through gates. Cement is pretty good for a walk-through gate. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of time, but you can't use it on a drive-through gate unless you make it really thick and heavy, because it'll crack. Wire fence material works okay in a walk-through gate. It doesn't work very well in a drive-through gate because it tends to bend and get pulled up quite a bit. And even around a walk-through gate, sometimes the edge of the fence material, the wire fence material, will come up, and then say if you're paying somebody to mow your yard and they get hung up in their mower, you may end up having to pay for damages to a mower. And like I said, the animals can kind of see through it to a certain extent, so they think they're getting somewhere, so they may tend to dig even though they don't realize they can't get anywhere. Rocks, in Florida, rocks are kind of hard to come by, so they're kind of expensive. They're also heavy. You can't drive on them that much or they'll tend to sink down into the sand. Even when you don't drive on them, they tend to sink in the sand. And you have to do a lot of digging to get enough rocks down in there deep enough to keep animals from digging under it. Alright, one problem you'll run into, especially in Florida with our sandy soil, is the fence companies tend to use 4x4s, and they tend to use 8-foot 4x4s, and a lot of times they won't even use the entire 8 feet. They'll dig down a couple of feet at the most, put the post in the ground, put cement around it, and then cut the top off. So you don't necessarily have a lot of post in the ground, and so the best thing to do is not to disturb the ground right around the post. And the way you avoid that is by using a 2x4 stake, and then just drive the stake as close as you can to the post, perpendicular to it, so that you're as close as you can to either the cement or the post, and that way you're not disturbing the ground that's really close to that post. If you disturb it and then you have a big storm, you're liable to have your fence fall over. And be sure and put a board, like a 2x4, on top of the 2x4 when you're driving it into the ground with the sledgehammer, and then that way you won't split the stake or mushroom the head of it and make it look bad. Depending on the type of wood you get, if it's a good treated 2x4, whatever it is, 2x6, 2x8, if it's a really good treated board, in this part of Florida it'll last 5 to 10 years. It really depends on what the weather's like, how much water there is, if you got a sprinkler head spraying it, how bad the insects are in your area. If you really have an area that's a big problem, you could always use a piece of steel. That's just expensive and more difficult to get. If you have to dig more than a thin slot to get your board into the ground, be sure to dig more on the side of the fence opposite from the way the animals will be coming from. That way you're not disturbing the ground. Once you disturb the ground, it makes it easier for them to get through. I like to use a thin spade to dig the slot, or maybe a sharpshooter if I'm having to dig a lot. Try not to dig too deep. Once you get it close, put your 2x into the ground and then tap it into place with a sledgehammer. You might want to put a 2x4 on top of it when you're hitting it with the sledgehammer so that you don't splinter the board. When you're through, if your board sticks up too high, you've probably lost a lot of dirt from either driving through the area or animals digging under your fence. So fill in around it with some dirt, maybe even gravel, to ramp the ground up to the height of the board. This way you won't tend to push the board over when you're driving over it. Then you can put some fertilizer down and maybe sprig some grass and water it occasionally until your ground and the grass gets reestablished. That's the end of the video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And like I said, if you're out on a forum where somebody's looking for an answer to something like this, be sure and give them a link to this video. Thanks.